Mark London, co-author of the book, The Four Little Dragons, Inside Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore at the Dawn of the Pacific Century. The book is out, it's new. Should Americans fear this thing that you call the Pacific Century?
I'm not sure fear is the right word, Bruce. America should pay attention. America is a very parochial country. There are a lot of people who don't know the difference between Taiwan and Thailand, and it will behoove everyone to learn that. Japan and China are pretty well known here. Teddy White had the image, though, of Japan being the aircraft carrier and the four little dragons, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, being the flotilla behind them. Their trade numbers are skyrocketing. They had skyrocketed. They're leveling off a little this year. They've made more progress in 20 years than Africa and South America have in 200. So we should pay attention to them. These are tremendous economic competitors. And if we don't pay attention to them, if we don't learn our lessons from what they're doing right and what they teach us about what we're doing wrong, they're going to continue to grow at our expense.
We've got 90 minutes to get into a lot of the specifics of each of these dragons. So why don't you speak a little bit more generally about what you mean by the Pacific Century? Is that your own terminology?
No, I think that's been... we conceived the book in the early 80s, and it took a while for it to get a definition. And I think at about that time, the Pacific Century became a watchword to describe, I think, Japan's terrific economic rise, China's emergence from behind the bamboo curtain, and recognition that these countries were going to be a factor. People, some of my Asian friends are kind, and they say that, well, America is a Pacific country. The Pacific part of us almost was North Dakota this week, but we are a Pacific country. But I don't think that the Pacific Century at this point includes America. I think America is now straddling between the Pacific Century and our friends over in Europe are saying, well, wait until 1992 and we're going to be back with a European century. So I think the watchword came before the book. But if people want to give us credit for authorship, we'll take it.
Sure, and let me tell our audience that we told you throughout the day that we were going to have both authors of this book. Brian Kelly cannot make it tonight. We planned to have him, and I'm sorry he got held up. But we're going to spend another half hour or so before we go to the phones talking with Mark London to hear more about what's in here. And we'll be putting a lot of things on the table, and we invite you to participate after we open the phones by using the phone numbers that we'll put up on the screen later on, and or we'll put them up right now. And also, we are international tonight, and we invite calls from those who live outside the United States. And I suppose it would be a good exercise as we go to the phones to see if we can't hear from some people in Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, or generally the Pacific Rim. It would be an interesting notion to see, or exercise to see if you agree with what Brian Kelly and Mark London, who happens to be here tonight, have said about that part of the country. Why did you write the book?
Well, Brian and I love to be travelers without being tourists. And as you know, this is our second book. We wrote a book about the Amazon first. And the premise of the Amazon book was to describe the conflict between the development of the Amazon and the destruction of the environment. And we were very, very impressed with the nature of a frontier when we were down there. And we were looking around for other frontiers. The natural one, I think, that everybody could think of, given some time, would be Siberia. Well, Siberia is a tough right now. We came up with the idea of let's look at a different kind of frontier, not a geographic frontier, but an economic frontier. And what were the emerging economic nations? And these are the ones that came to mind. Again, I give some credit to Teddy White. Can't acknowledge that today. He's not around anymore. But he, in the New York Times in about 84, 85, he said that, watch out, Japan's already won the war, and if you're not careful, these are the people who are going to just lick up everything that's left.
I'll quote exactly then. On page 18 of the book it says, quoting from Teddy White, American industry grew up in partnership with European industry, but Japan rouses different fears. Behind Japan, the big dragon, some call it, marched the four little dragons, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, following in its path, and behind looms China and India, desperate as they are to raise their standard of living at the expense of American standards if necessary. Isn't that the basis of American fears, that nobody else can go up unless we go down?
That is. I think that that may be subsiding somewhat. It's not that simple that one goes up, the other goes down. I mean, I think that with a proper trade policy, we can all benefit. I think that if I'm in favor of open markets, and I think that we have to continue to push these Asian countries to open their markets, and I think everybody can benefit. So that's what the Asians, Korea and Japan, are very closed economies, as everyone knows, and they fear that, that they can't operate in equilibrium with the United States, and I disagree with that.
The book is unique in its approach in that it's not a mere travel log. How would you compare it to Inside Asia Today, for example, by John Gunther?
Well, we read Inside Asia. I read all the John Gunther books several years ago. John isn't with us either, so I can be a little tougher on him. He was sort of a hysterical writer. I think he figured that he had the playing field to himself. So he went over there and he basically reported whatever he wanted to report, liked whoever he wanted to like, and disliked a number of people. I think he was somewhat racist. I think he was sexist. But no one knew any different back then. We stand by every fact in this book. And I think Gunther was about 40 years ago. In 40 years, we'll still stand by every fact in this book. We pride ourselves on being journalists. We also try to be writers. Some of the comments that we've received so far are that the book is witty and entertaining. Well, we want to do that. We want to make people smart in a pleasurable way. This is not a textbook. This is nothing to be frightened about. This is a book for people who know that, that this is an important part of the world, and it gives them a glimpse at what's going on over there. It puts a human face on Asia.
Well, there's a lot of in fact, the whole thing is first person.
It's written in the we, yes.
And it tells the story of your travels. When did you go there?
We each did 5 trips from March of '86 through September of '87. Sometimes we were together, sometimes we were apart. Some of the trips were 6 weeks. One of the trips was 6 weeks. Others were mostly 3 weeks. And we had a haphazard itinerary. For example, the first time we went to Taiwan, we said to the government, "Show us everything you want to show us." Well, the second time we went, we just arrived, and we didn't tell anyone we were there, and we went to see whatever we wanted to see. Brian went to Korea by himself, and he was there for 3 weeks. And then he went to see Kim Dae-jung, the opposition leader, who then was under house arrest. And Brian came back to his room, and he wasn't there more than 5 minutes, and the phone rings, and it's the Korean press office. They say, "Oh, Mr. Kelly, how come you didn't tell us you were in Korea?" So we had different modus operandi for the different trips.
You think of yourselves as journalists. You're a Washington lawyer. What else are you?
I'm a father now, which makes writing even more difficult. Brian, too. Everyone used to say to me, "How can you practice law and write books at the same time?" And I say, with one hand tied behind my back. But having an 18-month-old son is much more difficult. I practice law completely separate and apart from this writing. I used to be a newspaper reporter. That's how Brian and I met. My law practice does not involve international trade or lobbying or anything like that. I'm very careful to make sure that the two don't overlap because, again, I want to bring some objectivity to the subject matter.
And Brian Kelly, what's his background?
Brian is he's a journalist through and through. He and I were newspaper reporters together, then in New Jersey, then Brian went to Chicago, and about 4.5 years ago he came to Washington. He's the editor of Regardes magazine, which is a controversial business magazine about Washington.
Whose idea was it to write this book?
Well, we did the Amazon book, and the Amazon book, as you can see from the reviews on the back of this one, did very well. It was very well received. It was translated into a number of languages, and it's another book that I stand by every fact in that book today, and we like to think that maybe we raised some consciousness about what was going on down there. Now it finally made the cover of Time magazine. We could have used that when we were trying to sell books. So we said, well, maybe we're authors, and maybe we can do this again. And Simon & Schuster, a number of publishers had some interest in us, and Simon & Schuster signed a contract with us. And the contract was for a book about Cuba. And we went down to Miami. We spent some time in Miami in February, coincidentally. But we had some political problems working things out with the Cuban government. We wanted total access. We wanted no questions asked. And it's a different society. It was difficult for us to negotiate that. And we said, fine. We want to do something else. Simon & Schuster said, well, what else do you want to do? And we said, well, there's Asia. And they said, fine, you do it and give it to us, and we'll be happy to publish it. And that's really, it's no more scientific than that.
How did you divide up the work between yourself and Brian Kelly?
Well, Brian and I are very different people. I wake up at about 5:30 in the morning, again, when we're together, and I'd come back at noon, and Brian would still be in bed. And I'd say, Brian, this is what we're going to do today. And we'd hang out together until about 8:30. I'd go to sleep, and he'd stay up until about 2 or 2:30, and Brian would tell me what he saw, and we'd compare the notes. Well, we developed different tastes and different smells, and it just so happened that there are countries that to say I like better is simplistic, but I felt more comfortable writing about, and they weren't the same countries that he felt comfortable writing about.
And we're showing a picture of you and your colleague. I think the audience can tell that that's Brian on the left of the screen. Typical pose of journalist authors, I suppose.
Yeah, he doesn't know what a tie is.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the substance of all of this. Korea. Did you take them in any particular order? Did you rank these four dragons? In
no, I was being interviewed the other day by a journalist from Taiwan, and she said to me, which one do you like the best? And Jack Anderson had a column on Sunday about the book, and she said, well, I told her I really can't say. She said, well, I read Jack Anderson's column, and there were more words about Korea than there were about the other places. Well, that's not true at all. Each one of these countries is very different from the other, yet there are similarities. And it's impossible to say which one you like the best. Korea is a tough nut to crack. Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong are Chinese cultures. Korea isn't, but Korea is a Confucian culture. So the four are alike. Koreans are very, and again, it's how do you generalize about 45 million people, but they're very tough, aggressive, proud, and they're not very self-deprecating. And I like, to poke fun at people, and you do that in Korea, and someone will take a poke in your nose. But it's all for fun. I mean, the idea of a good time in Korea is a bunch of businessmen go out, they drink as much bad scotch as they can, they pass around a microphone and karaoke singing, and they punch each other in the nose, and they go home, and that's a great night. And 2 hours later, they wake up and they work another 18 hours. Korea is a unique place. Brian spent much more time there than I did. He's a much better drinker than I am. He needs less sleep than I am. But the Koreans just wore him down. I mean, there's no way he could keep up with them.
What's the role, what is the profile of the Reverend Moon over there?
Not much at all. Reverend Moon is much better known here in the United States than he is over there. Korean has a pretty widespread Christianity movement over there, but he's really not a factor in it. Over there, he's an industrialist. Reverend Moon has a pretty big industrial empire over there, but the connotations of Moonies and his sort of the idea that he's influenced peddling in the United States really doesn't carry over there. He's a prominent citizen, but he is not as controversial over there at all as he is here. What's
the legacy of the United States over there after the Korean War?
Korea, we went to Incheon, where I think MacArthur came ashore, and frankly we expected people would come out. My friend used to tell me when went to France after World War II, Franklin and Roosevelt, Franklin and Roosevelt. Well, nobody paid any attention to us in Incheon. And Koreans are very, very proud, and in a way they've come to resent the United States. The way they've resented Japan for two reasons. One, Japan colonized them for a long time. And the other reason is that Japan is Big Brother, and then the United States is Big Brother. We went to a meeting of some radical students at Yonsei University, and the United States at this time, frankly, I can't remember if Marcos was out or we were just about our toe was on his rear end and he was about to go out. And frankly, I was pretty proud about that. And I said that, you know, the United States does the right thing. And they said, no, the United States has no business even having anything to do with Marcos. You put Marcos in, now you kick him out. You have no business dictating what policies go on over here. So there's a resentment that the United States arm may be too long in Korea.
Well, President Notaewu is here in town this week, and we want to show the audience a clip of some of his comments about our presence over there and get your reaction to it. Let's listen to President Notaewu.
U.S. forces will remain as long as both governments and both peoples believe it is in the interest of peace. And of course, our forces will remain as long as there is a threat from the north.
I welcome and applaud the pledge of President Bush and the American government that U.S. ground troops will remain as long as the Korean people want and need them. And on this point, I must tell you that the voice of the Korean people is clear. A very recent poll has shown that 94% strongly support the presence of U.S. troops.
Obviously, we were led into that by President Bush, but your response?
Well, I think that President Bush learned a lesson from Carter. About 10 years ago, Carter talked about withdrawing U.S. troops, and it didn't go over well. U.S. troops, I think the Korean people begrudgingly will admit that we play a tremendous role over there. The presence is somewhat controversial because the American base is in the heart of Seoul. Real estate is worth a fortune. The presence is very, very visible. So I think that rather than troop withdrawals in the future, there may be some talk about making the presence a little more subtle. You have to understand that the South Korean-North Korean border is as heavily armed a border as exists anywhere in the world. And there's a hair trigger there. I mean, you probably remember, I think it was in the mid-1970s when there was a tree in the way, and the United States sent some soldiers to chop down the tree, and they were hacked to death by North Korean soldiers. I mean, it's wacko. I mean,
we've got a lot to get on the table. We're going to go to the phones in about 10 or 15 minutes, but I want to remind people that if you've been watching or if you just joined us, we are going to open the phone so that you can talk to Mark London, who, with Brian Kelly, has written a book about the Pacific Rim countries called The Four Dragons. The phone numbers are on the bottom of your screen. Let me mention them out loud. If you live in the Eastern or the Central time zones, you can use the number 202-628-2525. If you live in the Pacific or the Mountain time zones, it's 202-783-2727. And if you're calling from outside the boundaries of the United States, and I mentioned earlier we'd be particularly interested in hearing from you if you are in or live among the Four Dragons or somewhere in the Pacific. Area code 202-737-6734 is the number for you after you dial the appropriate country code, and we'll go to the phones in about 10 or 15 more minutes.
My respects to anyone who lives in the Four Dragons who's watching, because it's about 5 in the morning over there right now.
Well, it happens. Singapore, a city-state. It's rather unique.
Singapore is fascinating. I think that a lot of the credit to the westernization of Asia, the good part of it, belongs to Lee Kuan Yew, who has been the head of Singapore since its birth. And Singapore is only about 2.5 million people. And in 25 years, Singapore has come from the swamps, Paul Theroux wrote St. Jack, and you get a sense of a sin city, to a thoroughly modern city. I mean, Singapore is like, well, White Flint Mall here in Washington, a Water Tower Place in Chicago. It's a shopping mall. No one spits, no one honks. They have self-policing cars. Some of the commercial cars have lights on top, so if you go too fast, your light goes and everybody knows you're speeding. It's benign socialism. Everyone has a house. Everyone has a job. And a few years ago, the economy was stagnating. Well, they restructured the economy and they're booming again. They have a terrific advantage in being small. But they have a funny sense of where they belong in the world. Singapore was very, very important at the beginning of the century when shipping was important because it's the Straits of Malacca. But now people wonder, why are we here? And they have a large Indian population, a large Malay population, a large Chinese population, and some European population. They're constantly trying to meld all of this together. They hired J. Walter Thompson to write the national anthem. They're always trying to figure out what does it mean to be Singaporean. But they've almost perfected themselves so much that some of our friends have said it's boring. We have no crime, we have no dirt, we have no violence. It's boring.
What do they do?
Well, we went to a concert. A fellow named Charlie Couture, who is the rage of the European, well, I guess in France and I guess the European teenagers. And we went there and we expected, okay, fine, we're going to see some action. Well, it was in the auditorium of an industrial building, and no one clapped until the very end, and then people politely clapped. No one stood up except for a few Frenchmen. Well, David Bowie was on a world tour. The only place he didn't sell out was in Singapore. What do? They go to work. They work very, very hard. They go home, they read a book like The Four Little Dragons, and they go to sleep. You know, these countries are developing, and some of them have gone so far so fast that they haven't had a chance to do anything in their leisure time. They have no leisure time to speak of because they're just working all the time.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong is trembling today. When we were there, obviously, it looked like China was opening up, and Hong Kong, all was well in Hong Kong. We write in the book, though, about our friend who we call David Wang. He's going back to China. Is that his real name? That's not his real name. We write a lot about David's social life, so we decided we'd protect him. He kept saying, well, Mark, make me famous. I said, you don't want to be famous the way we're going to make you. Even then, though, he'd go back into China. We accompanied him on one trip, and you could see how the gloom come over him and the fear. And now fear pervades the colony. Think of it, Bruce, if we knew in 1997 that Noriega was coming to be the President of the United States, all of the people in Hong Kong, or virtually all of them, escaped from China. And now they're about to become China again. And that was fine until Tiananmen Square. And now no one knows. There are some wacko proposals. One is to buy a piece of the Northern Territory of Australia and move all of Hong Kong there. Another is to buy an island in the Caribbean and move all of Hong Kong there. And another one is to invite the United Nations to move to Hong Kong, because the feeling is that if the United Nations is there, then China won't come in and invade. A
little background on 1997.
On July the 1st, 1997, Hong Kong goes back to China. Hong Kong itself, the island, Hong Kong is many, many islands. There is one island called Hong Kong Island, and that was ceded in perpetuity to England. But England also got most of the territory in a 99-year lease. And when Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s was negotiating with China, she said, well, England is going to keep what England deserves to have forever. And China said, no, we want all of the leases or none of the leases. And so finally she agreed that everything is going to go back to China on July 1st, 1997. And the image of the Red Army marching back into Hong Kong has got to strike fear in the hearts of people now that they've seen what the Red Army did in Beijing. Unfortunately, Chinese governments have shown a willingness over the years to sacrifice thousands of their own people for a cause. I mean, one only need look at the Civil War in the late 40s to know what I'm talking about.
Well, Sir David Wilson, who's the governor of Hong Kong, was in Washington this week, and he met with members of the administration and Congress, and he told the National Press Club that we covered that one of the most important issues before them was the number of Vietnamese who are fleeing into Hong Kong at the very time when Hong Kong residents are thinking of leaving. And he had this to say, and I want to get your reaction to it. We'll go to that tape.
One of the biggest problems the Hong Kong administration has to face: how to cope with some 56,000 people, 33,000 of them having arrived during this year alone, coming in small boats along the coast of China at a rate in the early summer this year of some 300 to 500 a day, and on some occasions up to 1,000 a day. In terms of population size, since the beginning of this year, it's as though 1.5 million people had sailed up the Potomac River right into the heart of Washington here. That's the comparison, your population to ours.
Your comment?
Well, Wilson is beleaguered these days. He also announced this week a $16 billion development program in order to give confidence to investors. The Vietnam refugee problem is particularly tough for him because they've now started to repatriate the Vietnamese, to send them back, which is an awful fate for these people to handle. Hong Kong is not making the living conditions easy for the Vietnamese refugees, and Wilson feels that Hong Kong is unfairly burdened with the refugees, and I think that what he's, far be it from me to read his mind, but what I think he's trying to do is he's trying to make the problem worse in order to involve the United States and some of the other, some of the European countries to help him come up with a solution. So that I think that they're going to continue to keep the living conditions bearable. It certainly won't make them inhuman, and send people back in order to develop a crisis that they can bring in larger players.
Your book, The Four Dragons, borrows from fiction, and there's a passage from Jean Le Carre, or Le Carre, depending on which is it. Do you know?
I call him Le Carre, but that's not his real name anyway, so I guess he can say whatever he wants.
Well, anyhow, he writes about basically the last person to leave Hong Kong, and I'll borrow from it, and he writes, "It's the colony's last day," he decided, some fictional character. Peking has made its proverbial telephone call, "Get out, the party's over." The last hotel was closing. He saw the empty Rolls-Royces lying around like scrap around the harbor, and the last blue-rinse, round-eye matron, laden with her tax-free furs and jewelry, tottering up the gangway of the last cruise ship, the last China watcher frantically feeding his last miscalculations into the shredder, the looted shops, the empty city waiting like a carcass for the hordes.
Le Carre, the literature of Hong Kong is wonderful. You know, rather than rewrite history, we borrowed from some of the rich literature. Hong Kong, Jan Morris writes wonderfully about Hong Kong. Ludlam writes well about Hong Kong. James Clavell writes well. That image, when I borrowed it and put it in the book, I thought to myself, well, maybe it may be a little outdated because China may actually be friendlier than everyone thought. But again, that all ended in early June of this year.
Well, 1997 is still a long ways away.
Right.
I mean, everyone seems to think that Hong Kong is somehow going to be overrun by the Chinese. Isn't it possible that Hong Kong will have a greater effect on the mainland than the mainland will have on Hong Kong?
That's what I think. Brian and I disagree on this. One of the things that's good about this is we could argue and refine our ideas. I think that Tiananmen Square was the last gasp of dying men. Certainly they're old, and I think that China, I think political reform and economic reform go hand in hand. And once, as I think Cole Porter said, once they've seen gay Paris, it's hard to put them back on the farm. And China's had a tremendous outflow of students to the United States who have now gone back. They have television sets, VCRs, and I think that, that it has clamped down. But it's going to be very, very hard for the world to stomach the destruction of Hong Kong the way that we saw at Tiananmen Square.
I want to remind our audience, if you're watching this live, we're going to go to the phones in about 5 minutes or so as we talk a little bit more about Taiwan, which is one of the four dragons referred to in the book by our guest, Mark London, who's the co-author of this book. We're interested in your thoughts about this rather wide-ranging and future-looking kind of book. And before we get to Taiwan, let me ask you, when I looked through it, and I haven't read it yet, all I could think of was things like future shock, megatrends. I mean, are these words that are appropriate to this book?
Well, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but again, there are lessons to be learned. The great lessons, I think, of these countries are, number one, I think that there's a moderation of individual greed. James Fallows in the New Atlantic talked about this, and I think that there's a sense of the common good over there, and that's a Confucian ideal. But I think more than anything, there's an emphasis on education. One of the things that strikes you when you go over there is that there's no lack or waste of human resource. In the United States, there's a tremendous waste of human resources. We have a tremendous number of people who are not working productively, who are not educated to the best that they can, who don't think that education is important. Well, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, number one lesson to the children is you go to school and you study. You read about suicides in Japan of people who, for kids who fail their exam. Maybe they go a little too far. But future shock or megatrends, well, the megatrend over there is an old trend, that the immigrants into the United States taught us, and that is that they can take away your book, and they can take away your furniture, and they can take away your car, but they can't take away your mind. And these people over there have learned that lesson. These are refugee areas. Taiwan is everyone, nearly everyone who is on Taiwan has a memory of China. Hong Kong, we've been talking about. Singapore was always an area of the flow of people from India and from China. And Korea, they know what war is like. So these people are motivated by the fear of failure. And how do you accomplish success? By learning, by being educated.
Taiwan?
Taiwan is, these are all, I use unique. I mean, you're unique, I'm unique. But the uniqueness of Taiwan is that it didn't really matter until 1949. It was an island off the coast of China. And then in 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled from Mao, they all came to Taiwan. And I think Taiwan suffered from a very bad image for a long time. A lot of it was deserved. Chiang Kai-shek was not a comedian. I mean, he was a very tough general. Taiwan really held on to the image of being a litmus test for the Cold War for a long time. But Taiwan was a tremendously pleasant surprise for us. Taiwan's income distribution is it's nearly flat. It's as fair and equitable as anywhere in the world. Its energy and ability to retool, to deal with market trends is very, very impressive. Korea is very dependent on large companies with large capital investments. The Hyundai car and Samsung televisions are examples. You can't name anything that's produced in Taiwan, I'll bet. Very, very difficult to do that because they're small industries and they can move very, very rapidly into other products. Bicycles are a very, very big product there. Well, bicycles are very trendy and they change, and Taiwan is successful in its flexibility. It's sitting on a hoard of money today. I think its foreign reserves are about $80 billion, second only to Japan, but when you're up there that high, who's counting? Taiwan suffers from the Shanghai mentality of keeping your money in your mattresses because you don't know if you're going to be there much longer. And they really, one of the problems of the country is it's choking on too much money. It has an unemployment rate of about 1%. Economists say that 2% starts the definition of unemployment, so it's fully employed. Taiwan, like these other countries, like Korea, is now maturing, and it's going to develop an internal market and begin to develop a national identity, which will depend on how it views itself vis-a-vis China. Will Taiwan be around in 50 years is a question that no one can answer because they don't know whether they're going to go back to China and on what terms, or whether they'll continue to be Taiwan. You can't talk about an independent Taiwan because people say independent from what? We are China. You look at the maps of China and you see something that spreads all the way out to the Soviet Union. You say, well, wait a minute, we're just on a little island, and it says China on the little island, and then occupied territories on the rest of the map. So Taiwan, I think, has shed the image of being a pariah. Unfortunately, Diplomatically, it's very tough for it to come into the mainstream because people find that, well, if we have relations with Taiwan, we can't have relations with China. But I think that international commerce is making a lot more sense, and Taiwan is being brought into the world picture a lot more in the last 5 years.
All right, we'll go to the phones. We'll invite everybody to get in early. We've got some room, but there's a lot to talk about, and we've only touched the surfaces of it. We're unfortunate that Brian Kelly couldn't make it. He was originally... Where is he, by the way?
Brian is covering the Virginia gubernatorial campaign. He thought he'd be in Richmond and be able to drive right up, but he ended up in Farmville, Virginia, which he said to me is somewhere between North Carolina and North Dakota. He wasn't exactly sure, and he just couldn't get back in time.
But Mark London seems to be doing a pretty good job of holding down the fort for him as we talk about the four little dragons: Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Everything is open for consideration, and before the first call, one question. What do you think the biggest misimpression is that Americans have about that area?
Well, I think that Americans lump it all together, and they think that, well, you know, whatever Japan does, you know, it means that's what Taiwan does. And these countries, especially in trade talks, and these are, again, sophisticated trade negotiators in the United States, they complain that the United States just does not differentiate enough between those countries, among those countries. And also, I think that, you know, it's Asian, so it's foreign. But, you know, the complexion of the United States is changing. We have many, many more Asian immigrants. That's the latest wave of immigration. And it behooves us to know where these people came from, what their ideals are and what their goals are, and that they're not so foreign from us.
Frequently it's the case when we get something a little bit unusual on the program, we draw a lot of first-time callers, and I ought to point out to those that the best way to succeed in getting on this call-in program is to dial the phone number, and once you get a ringing sound, just stay there with us, because if you hang up, you lose your place in line. Let's take the first call from Mark Brown, co-author of The Four Little Dragons from nearby Fairfax, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. London, in the coverage prior to Tiananmen Square, they interviewed a thinker in the Forbidden City, and he said those demonstrations could be as significant for Asia as the French Revolution. And my question to you is, that statue in Tiananmen Square was an extraordinary event. It conflicted with Buddhist and Confucian. My question is, does it conflict with Buddhist and Confucian philosophy? And could this mark a significant change in the thought process of the intellectuals of China?
Well, I don't think it conflicts with Confucian philosophy. I think Confucius was a revolutionary himself, because he believed in popular education. At the time, education was confined to the noble class. I agree with you that that the statue, though, was revolutionary in recent history for China, because it brought in a Western symbol. And that's what I said before. Once you bring these American students back to China, I think you've changed the country, or where they touch the country, forever. And I sense in your question that you don't want to believe that the democracy movement is dead, and I agree with you there. I think that you know, the pen is mightier than the sword, and every dog has his day, and I think that Deng Xiaoping has had his day, and it may be his last day, and that symbol is something that I think that you may see over and over again. But don't think that it's that revolutionary, because a popular movement, well, Mao is the greatest example of a popular movement, but the popular movement in the Western tradition does have some roots in Confucianism, although there are many differences, obviously, between the two cultures.
Next call, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Yes, Mr. London.
Yes.
I'd like to know what you think of the relationship which perhaps Australia could represent to the Pacific Rim nations, in particular the Four Little Dragons, and compare that perhaps to the relationship which America represented to the Atlantic industrial nations.
Well, I think that there is some similarity and a big difference. The big difference is that I think that the United States had an intellectual tradition which you can see in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution, and I don't think that Australia has been revolutionary in the political or social process. But there is a similarity in that Australia is a terrific natural resource for these countries. In iron ore and in gold and natural resources, these countries are very, very poor, and Australia will feed them. Australia is also a lily pad for refugees. I think you're going to see many people who are fleeing Hong Kong will go to Australia because it's close and because there are strong Asian communities in Australia. But I think as a beacon, Australia will not match the United States. You will not see a Statue of Liberty in Sydney Harbor.
Carlsbad, California, you're next.
Yes, I have a comment and then a couple of fast questions. Number one, I was in the Pacific Rim in 1968, and I visited Singapore. And is the old Whipple, is that the Whipple Hotel, the Old English hotel there? I think it's called a Whipple. Is that still up?
Raffles, I think you're talking about.
Raffles, that was it.
Raffles is still there. Raffles is a relic. When we were there, they were arguing over how to renovate it because it's a squat, rundown building across from Raffles Center, which is a 73-story hotel. It's still there. They're still serving Singapore slings, as you know. That's where they were invented. They still have the tiger tracks when the tiger came into the snooker room and they shot him. But it's antiquated. I think that Korea sort of keeps it as an heirloom. There were the Sarkis brothers who started Raffles had two other hotels. They had one in Mandalay, and they had one in Rangoon, and they had one in Penang, the E&O Hotel in Penang. We stayed there, and that still has a lot more of its charm. And they serve horrible things like Malaysian oxtail soup, and as you digest it, you can watch the sunset over the water. It's much more functional than Raffles is. Raffles still gets the curious tourist trade. It's still there if you want to go back. But I think you can get a much more comfortable room across the street and then go across and have a Singapore sling in the old bar.
Caller, you're still on the air.
Yes. Anyway, the comment was, I noticed the British in 1968 in that area still had quite a bit of power there in Singapore and also in Hong Kong. One of my questions is, do the British have anything to do with the trade area there? And the second question would be, do we, in this country, truly understand the Oriental mind? I know when I was there, I never really got to understand, like you say, their idea of a good time, or the idea is kind of different from ours. And we're having such a hard time understanding Japan, how to do business with them and their mores and what have you. Do we really understand that whole area there? Are they different types?
Thank you, sir.
Let me go back. Well, let me do the easy one first. The British really have no influence anymore in Singapore that I can tell. The British are very influential still in Hong Kong. It's still a crown colony. You saw Sir David Wilson. You heard his accent, and so you can tell that the British are still powerful there. I'm sure one of the callers is going to talk about this. If the Brits had such a backbone, then why don't they give all the people in Hong Kong passports and let them come into Britain? We'll talk about that later. And by the way, you ought to go back there. The world has changed a lot since 1968. My father is an old Asia hand and has gone back and forth a lot, so I have a sense of what it was like there, and I think that you'll be amazed. As to your second question, do we understand the Oriental mind? I can only talk for myself and say no. These are cultures that are 5,000 years old. They're rich in tradition and subtleties that I certainly couldn't come close to understanding. And the book is not to let you know anything more than what we see and what we try to understand. Part of the problem that any of us has going over there is the language barrier. And I wish, when I went to the Amazon, I went equipped with Spanish and Portuguese. I spoke both of them fluently. And I thought about learning a language to go over to to go over to Asia. And I thought, what language am I going to learn? In Korea, they speak Korean, or Hangul, which is a very, very difficult language. In Taiwan, they speak Mandarin Chinese. In Hong Kong, they speak Cantonese. And in Singapore, you can basically get by with English, or Cantonese, or Tamil, or some of the sub-Indian continent languages. So I decided, well, first of all, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to learn these languages, and second of all, even if I did, it would only be of limited utility. So the answer is, to get to learn the Oriental mind requires a tremendous amount of effort, and Americans essentially are lazy, and you can't get it from watching TV. So the answer is not necessarily to understand, but is to appreciate the differences and to work together.
New York City, go ahead, please.
Yes, I tuned in while Mr. London was talking about Singapore, which he described as a kind of socialist society where everybody had a job and a home and so forth. Now, I'm probably out of date, but I had always thought of Singapore as kind of a benevolent dictatorship headed by one Mr. Key. What's happened to him? Is it a classless society? You make it sort of sound... well, I think I've made my question clear. What exactly kind of government does Singapore have?
It is. I don't think that I disagree with your characterization of a benevolent dictatorship. It's Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew has, in fact, just last week he announced that he is finally going to step aside in favor of, there is one prime minister between him and his son who's going to take over. Lee Kuan Yew is a benevolent dictator. He's done tremendous amount for the country. When I say socialist, in a way, the state forces savings so that the houses, the apartments that people own, they own in their individual names. So it's not socialist in the way that, you know, in the Soviet Union, until recently, there was no private ownership. There is private ownership, but it comes about by very, very tight state control over the economy and over all aspects of your life. For example, I'm sure that many of you know Lee Kuan Yew because he decided a couple of years ago that 2 is enough. What does he mean? He means that you shouldn't have more than 2 children. But then he decided, well, maybe the Malays are outnumbering the Chinese, and the Malay growth rate is greater than the Chinese. So maybe 2 or more now, if you can afford it, is the motto. When the head of state gets into the bedroom, people feel that maybe the state is getting a little too far into their lives. So he, when I say socialist, there's almost a big brother, but again, a benign big brother. I'm a fan of Singapore. Brian and I, again, we differ a little. Lee Kuan Yew is very, very tough on press restrictions, foreign press restrictions. He's very, very tough on. But the gentleman, the caller before, who was there in 1968, will be very pleasantly surprised with Singapore today. There's no malaria anymore. Hygiene is terrific. The water is clean. You know, for journalists who cover Southeast Asia, it's a great place to live because you can go to some of the really tough places in Indonesia or in the Philippines, and you come home and it's clean. You know your water's going to work. You know your telephone's going to work. You're asking people over in Asia to make a phone call. Well, heck, you know, the phone call that I used to make to my wife was easier and clearer to make from Singapore than it sometimes is from downtown D.C. to my home.
New York City, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm an American Buddhist. I've been a Buddhist for like 21 years now. I have a Japanese brother-in-law. I have coworkers from Singapore. I don't know if that helps you to understand the Oriental mind at all, but I'm a great admirer of the Oriental people. 2 quick questions.
Sure.
I just wanted to know, why don't we trade Alaskan oil with our Pacific neighbors? It'd correct our balance of trade so fast. Secondly, how much of the Hong Kong overflow do you think is going to end up in New York City, and what do you think the impact will be?
Well, the Alaskan oil issue, I think that was part of the quid pro quo back in the 70s. That as a matter of national security, we just couldn't sell domestic oil to anyone. I think it arose out of the Alaska pipeline was built at around the same time of the oil crisis in '73. There's a law, I don't remember what legislator whose name is associated with the law, and that's the reason. It may not make the same sense today with an oil glut around the world as it used to, because you're right. I mean, you send the oil across Alaska into ships that go through the Panama Canal, or the bigger ones that have to go all the way around, and you can send them to Japan, and your transportation costs are a lot less. And there was always talk, trade chits with Japan, take Japanese chits for Saudi oil and trade them for Alaska oil. That's why, because there's a law, that's why we don't do it.
As the Hong Kong overflow.
Oh, as to the Hong Kong overflow.
And will it show up in New York City?
Well, you got to believe that, I think last year there were 50,000 legal immigrants from Hong Kong, and that number is going to continue to increase. And they go to wherever they have family. And as you know, New York has a large Chinese population. You know, you say you're a big fan of the Oriental mind. To the extent that you can say there is something that's called the Oriental mind, so am I. And one of the things that defines the modern Oriental mind, again, is its devotion to education, its diligence, and discipline. And so to the extent that there is an overflow in New York of Hong Kong refugees, once they get assimilated, I think that the effect will be positive.
Monterey, California, go ahead.
Hello, I'm a foreign student from Hong Kong, and I've got two questions for you. Can you please express your opinion about the impact of the Tiananmen Square massacre on the brain drain of Hong Kong? And do you have any solution for the brain drain problem?
Well, caller, before Mark London goes ahead, how long have you been in this country? What are you studying, and do you intend to go back?
I'm only a high school student, and I'm only here studying for about 2 months. And the problem about whether I'm going back to Hong Kong or not is that it depends on the situation of Hong Kong after 1997.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
I think that that the brain drain will continue. I talked about the 50,000 immigrants last year. I bet that you'll find that most of them were educated, middle management class. And why would anyone risk staying around for till July 1st, 1997? You know, the Cultural Revolution was only 22 years ago, and one of the ideals of the Cultural Revolution was to kill Western influence. And so anyone who has a Western education has got to think twice about living in such an unpredictable society. Your question, I think, addresses a very, very important issue that the Chinese government has to deal with right now, and it has to give reassurances to Hong Kong that Tiananmen Square was an aberration. Now, it can't do that in October of 1989 because it only happened 4 months ago. But it has to address the psychological impact of Tiananmen Square. And if it does not, then David Wilson and all of his $16 billion development projects don't mean a hoot. People who are educated will not stay around and wonder what's going to happen after July 1st, 1997.
Let me just ask one more, or raise one more point before we go back to the phones, and that is that in some of the publicity about your book, the publisher says they, meaning you and Brian Kelly, may prove, they recognized in themselves and other Americans the self-satisfaction that may prove to be our nation's Achilles heel. Now, does that mean that you've concluded that Americans are lazy in comparison to the people of the Four Dragons?
Well, I don't know if laziness is quite the answer. We have a tremendous lack, as I said before, a waste of human resources. We also have, I think, too much emphasis on the short term. You know, the stock market has these gyrations the way it does, and nobody's thinking about the long term. And I think that the self-satisfaction that you get from making a profit today or tomorrow, and the lack of a long-term perspective is dangerous. I also think that many of our best minds are doing unproductive things. We
Like?
have too many lawyers.
How many lawyers are there in Japan?
I don't know the number, but I know that there are more in Washington, D.C. by a multiple than there are in all of Japan. We have too many lawyers. We have too many people who are putting companies together and then tearing them apart and selling off pieces of it. It's very lucrative work, but I think we have mastered and now I think overmastered the service industry. My counterparts in these countries, my friends and contemporaries, are in charge of productive industries, and I think that we've gotten away from what is important in our economy, and we have too many words and not enough output, I think.
We have half an hour to go with Mark London. He's the co-author of this book, The Four Little Dragons. The phone lines are open as we continue to get your own comments about your thoughts about these 4 Pacific Rim countries. The next call for him is from Milford, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening, Mr. London. It's a pleasure listening to your observations.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions. The first is, these nations are industrialized nations now. I would like you to comment about the condition of their environment. And the second question is, we hear so much about anti-Americanism sentiment among students within Korea. Without addressing the military issue, why do so many Korean students have animosity towards the United States?
The environment question is, it's a good question because for a long time you can excuse abuse of the environment, well, we're just developing and we have to make a sacrifice. It's either that tree or the paper that we need to write a law on or something like that. That's a very crude analogy. But now you're right, they are industrialized countries and they don't have that excuse. Taiwan, I'm a big fan of Taiwan, but Taiwan has done a miserable job of managing its environment. I'm not sure whether or not it's because they believe that they would not be in Taiwan for a long time, so let's just use up the place and leave our litter behind, or it's just that they were in such a hurry to develop economically that they gave no thought to it. Environmentalism is the luxury of a mature society. Well, Taiwan, the consciousness is changing. I think that there is a lot more concern with pollution controls. Korea, the same thing. Now, what does that mean? It means that products are going to become more expensive. Korea's economy is slowing down a bit this year because of the political openings and the call for higher wages. The fact that the country itself is becoming wealthier and there's a greater internal demand and some inflation then. And there's again a concern for the environment. Well, if you pay $10 for pollution control, well, that's $10 that you're not putting in the bank, or $10 that you're not putting to what they may call productive use. The United States ought to, number one, set an example itself, and number two, spread that example over there and raise their concern about the environment. That's a very good question. As far as the anti-Americanism of the students
in Korea,
I used the analogy of the big brother before. Well, maybe here it's the parent. I think that they just resent American influence. There's a lot of lingering animosity toward the United States from the Kwangju incident in 1980. Kwangju is the Kent state of Korea, and it's when Chun Doo-hwan came to power, and there was a lot of deaths in Kwangju, and no one knows how many. You talk to the military, and it's just a few, and you talk to the people in Kwangju. Brian went to Kwangju and talked to many residents, and you just added up those numbers. The military numbers don't make sense. Brian and I believe that the United States should issue a statement about what it did at Kwangju. In other words, there's a lot of suspicion that the United States said to the internal Korean army, well, we'll man the borders and we'll take care of the security, and you can send troops to Kwangju and you can quell the student revolution. That's a suspicion. Well, we should put an end to that by coming up with the facts of what happened. And if it's so, if the United States did have some involvement, and I'm sorry is not a bad thing to say. It's 9 years ago. It's a different administration. And if it didn't have that, then we should trumpet that fact and get rid of the suspicion. And I think that the Kwon-Ju incident is a lot of the reason for the anti-Americanism.
Madison, Wisconsin. Go ahead, please.
Yes, the last 2 years I spent in Asia marketing American products, and was interested in hearing your opinion on the role of Japan in the development of Taiwan and Korea.
Well, Japan has been, as you know, Taiwan and Korea are both former Japanese colonies, and Japan essentially built the infrastructure in Taiwan. One of the arguments that we always get when we're over there, and we say, well, just open up your markets, and therefore the United States just won't have anything to complain about. And they say, well, if we open up our markets, the United States won't be able to compete. The Japanese will come in here, and the Japanese are very, very heavy investors in these countries. And you'll see in the book, in the Samsung factory, you can see the Made in Japan stamp on the television boxes. I mean, these are subcontracted out to Korea, and they're actually made in Korea, but they carry the Made in Japan stamp on them. Look, I said before that the Cultural Revolution was 22 years ago. Well, World War II was 44 years ago. And Japan was not in the top 10 of these Four Little Dragons' favorite nations. Japan wreaked devastation over most of them. And I think that they're wary of Japan's becoming as powerful as it is in the world. But as far as your question is of how much influence on the development, a lot of influence on the development.
Are their societies homogeneous?
Which?
All four of them?
Well, within themselves, well...
That's what I mean.
Well, Singapore, no, because Singapore is an Indian, Chinese, Malay, and European society. Hong Kong is about 98% Chinese, and essentially from the Shanghai or Canton area. So it is really somewhat homogeneous. Korea, very much so. You know, Japan is a very almost xenophobic society. I mean, the Japanese, like the Japanese, well, Koreans are very, very chauvinistic in the same way. And Taiwan, I think, is homogeneous, certainly in its language. Now it's very, very Mandarin, and most of the people, the nationalists, came from the same area. But they met the local Taiwanese, and I think now, 40 years later, they are becoming much more homogeneous than they were.
Marina Valley, California, you're next.
Hello, yes, Mr. London. I must compliment you on your language. You sound like Jim Wright. You know, I heard his broadcast earlier today, and it was a pleasure to hear him talk. And well, my question concerns President Nixon's visit to China. And would we be talking about this subject if President Nixon hadn't opened the floodgates to the United States for students to come to the United States and study and go back to China, and for their theme to be that of, you know, of the Statue of Liberty and looking at our leaders of our forefathers in this country, you know, such as Lincoln and other people? Do you think that Richard Nixon may have a statue of himself in Tiananmen Square one day?
Well, you know that Richard Nixon is very popular in China. And I think the answer is to your question, no, we would not have had Tiananmen Square without Richard Nixon's opening China. And we would not have had Tiananmen Square without the influence of the Western education influence on the student leaders. And, you know, China has now talked about forcing students to do labor before they go to the university, sort of to get them, knock the silliness out of them before they go to the university. But, you know, the figures that I had read were, I think that there were close to 35,000 Chinese students in the country last year. And I think that that had been going on for several years. So just say it was going on for 5 years at that level. That's 150,000. And as you know, Chinese have extended families, and with a great emphasis on education, the students who come to the United States, they're honored. They go back there and they're honored, and so their influence is much greater than it would be in the United States if someone went to Spain and came back. So I think that you cannot overstate the importance of American education on the Chinese students and its effect on Tiananmen Square.
Let me add one more country that you mentioned in the book, and that is Thailand. You're about ready to include that as one of the dragons.
That's right. Thailand, well, let me explain why Thailand is important. B.G. Lee, the son of Lee Kuan Yew, the lady who called and asked about the benevolent dictator, Lee Kuan Yew has a very, very bright son who was #1 and had double honors at Cambridge, just like his father. It's very discouraging when I meet someone my age who speaks 8 languages, and he speaks about David Ricardo, and he's a brigadier general in the army, and you know, what have I done? But B.G. Lee talked about the treadmill, and that if you don't keep up on the treadmill, you're going to fall off and somebody's going to step on you. Well, Japan almost priced itself out of the market and very wisely developed a new economy. Well, Korea now is going through this, and Taiwan is going through this. They don't have slave labor over there. Anyone who thinks that, you know, these countries are profiting because they have slave labor is wrong. Well, the development, the rudimentary development of textiles and the labor-intensive economies went to Thailand, and Thailand then began to develop, and it had the benefit of tremendous foreign investment. Well, now that's going to Sri Lanka and to India, and what's left in Thailand is it's beginning to add value to the products it produces. Thailand's a wonderful country. It's probably, in a way, the most pure of all these countries. It's never been conquered by anybody, so Thai has always been Thai. And it has a tremendous national identity that these other countries lack. They know what it means to be Thai. And the Thai people, it's a long way from Brazil, but they remind me a lot of my friends in Brazil. They like a good time, but they work very hard. The biggest problem with Thailand, to me, is the traffic. It takes forever to get around Bangkok. But the infrastructure has just not kept up with the development, but that will change too.
But it's poised to make its mark.
I think so, very much so.
Hampton, Virginia's next. Go ahead.
Hello. I'd like to make a comment. You're very knowledgeable about Taiwan. I just came from there 3 weeks ago, and I appreciate your comments about them. It is a terrific place.
Caller, was your trip business or pleasure?
Oh, we've lived there for years, and I've just moved back. My question, one, is how did you become so knowledgeable about it, and China and Hong Kong? My second question is, I'm very curious what you would think about the question of the world kind of standing by and watching what's happening to Hong Kong, why we as Americans have not put more pressure on our friends, the English. Was there really nothing we could do? Will we eventually, or will Taiwan eventually come to their rescue? I'd appreciate your comment.
Caller, is your assumption that Hong Kong ought not to go back to the Chinese?
No, but that, well, you know, we have an East Berlin, a West Berlin, we have a North Korea and a South Korea. Is there not something we can do for the Hong Kong people themselves who have been free all these years and are suddenly threatened?
Okay.
With their livelihood and their freedom.
Thank you.
Well, you've been over there, so you know the geography of Hong Kong, and you know that most of Hong Kong was subject to a 99-year lease. So no matter what the British did, China would get back most of the territory, and Britain would only be left with Hong Kong and the tip of Kowloon. And that's not very functional because Kai Tak Airport, I think, was in the Kowloon part that was ceded in perpetuity, but the landing rights to Kai Tak would be over China. The water, Hong Kong used to have perpetual water shortages. The water could be cut off. I think that so that the idea of Britain not doing anything is not fair because most of the leases were going to run out.
What about just resisting militarily? Just saying no more?
Out of the question. I mean, Britain is 10,000 miles away.
With United States support?
The United States would not go to war with China over Hong Kong.
Would China go to war over a resistance to the expiration of the leases?
Yes. I think that that was the threat, was that if...
That Maggie Thatcher had?
Well, Deng Xiaoping, I think, said that if you don't get out of the the new territory, certainly. You know, we intend to go in. If you were there, you know, caveat emptor, let the buyer of that property at the time beware. And at the time, remember, China in the early 80s, when these negotiations were going on, was opening up. Let me address something else you asked about Taiwan. Taiwan's funny because Taiwan, as you know, is a great haven for the refugees from communist China in the late 40s. And I said to my friends there, I said, hey, look, I said, you know, put your money where your mouth is. You got 6 million people who are about to flee just like you fled. Why don't you build some apartment houses? Well, that creates a big, big problem. Taiwan, as you also probably know, is, after Bangladesh, the most densely populated country in the world. Well, they can't absorb another 6 million people. Taiwan's influence on China is limited. I think Taiwan is almost stuck with what do we do right now is the question. Tiananmen Square, again, only happened 4 months ago, 5 months ago. Taiwan was expecting $3 billion of trade with China this year. So there was a rapprochement between the countries underway, de facto. And now I think it's just questioning what are we going to do. I think it's out of the question that Taiwan would militarily come to Hong Kong's assistance, though.
Mark London is a Washington lawyer, sometime journalist, and certainly an author of this book, The Four Little Dragons. Next call for him, Euless, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hello, you're on the air, sir.
Yes, sir. Mr. London, I think you just answered part of my question. I was wondering, and I'm reversing my question because it's sort of like a two-part. As far as China goes, what purpose do they have with Taiwan, or what's their aim long-term economically with Taiwan? And the other one, of course, is the Japanese. Economically, are they just happy and making money and turning it over, or is there a long-term plan, you know, between what they plan to do and what the Americans are doing now?
Well, if I understand your last question, Japan is now stepping up, and it's one of the, I think, probably the largest dispenser of foreign aid in the world right now. So it's assuming some global obligations. China's long-term economic plan with Taiwan, I don't think that's easy to answer. China doesn't have a long-term economic plan with Taiwan. There is not one person in Taiwan out of the 20 million who would tell you that he or she wants to live under China's economy. Taiwan's economy is light years ahead of China's. I think that if China has any economic plan vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's that it could invite the managers of Taiwan's economy to help China's economy get into the mainstream. For example, Taiwan has a wonderfully modern steel mill, China Steel. Well, they could go over and they could help increase productivity. China produces a tremendous quantity of rudimentary bicycles. Well, Taiwan, as I said before, in order to compete, had to add value to those bicycles and market and respond better to the market. Well, it could bring those middle managers over. But I think that's the only economic plan that China could possibly have from Taiwan. It's, let's learn how you did it.
All right. Santa Cruz, California. Go ahead.
Hello. I have 2 little children, and my husband's parents are, his father is Chinese and his mother is Japanese, and I'd like to know, if you were in my position, which language would you choose for your children to learn as a second language?
Well, if you want to go by sheer numbers, you know the answer to that. But that's a much more complicated question than you may think. Which Chinese are you going to teach them? The national language, or the official language of China is Mandarin. Well, if you teach them Mandarin, as I said before, you're going to be in trouble in Hong Kong. And you're going to be in trouble in many, many of the provinces in the western part of China. I think that Japanese, if your kids are going to be, want to be in the mainstream of today's economy, if they want to go work in the financial community, Japanese is certainly a lot more helpful. That's a toss-up. If I have a kid, and I think that...
you do.
I do. I have another one on the way. Brian has one. if I had to choose, I probably would go for Spanish. It's a lot easier.
I opened up by asking you if the Americans have anything to fear about the Pacific century, but on a narrower scale, in the short run, the preponderance of Asian students in schools, the percentage of PhD candidates that are Asian and so forth, is that something that we ought to be concerned about, on the assumption that not all of them are American citizens, but that there is a brain dead on our side?
I don't think so. Michael Chang was the American who won the French Open. I mean, Americans don't only look like me, and I think that the best thing that America can do is encourage a meritocracy, and that's what has made our country great. And that's when, a long time ago, someone asked me, is Tiananmen Square anathema to Confucianism? And the answer, again, I say is no, because Confucius believed in a meritocracy. Let the king be king, let the prince be prince, but let them earn their kingdom and their princeship.
Houston, Texas. Go ahead, please. You're next.
First of all, I'd like to say that I've agreed with almost everything Mr. London has said. The only thing I think he got wrong was in answering his question about the growth of anti-Americanism in South Korea. I really don't think the Kwangju thing had all that much to do with it. I believe that there's been a lot of third worldist ideologues teaching the social sciences in South Korean universities, and I think that these students who took over Kwangju were probably third worldist ideologues before then, and that's probably the reason why they're anti-American now. But my question is about Thailand. You mentioned Thailand, and I like what you said about it, about its potential of becoming, well, a fifth dragon. But it seems to me that the great break holding back economic development in Thailand is this growth of a general growth of protectionism throughout the world. In Western Europe, somewhat in the United States, in Japan, and in two of your four dragons as well. For example, there's a great potential for agricultural exports from Thailand. They produce rice about 1/3 of the cost of U.S. rice farmers, and about 1/10 the cost of Japanese farmers, but the Japanese won't allow Thai produce into their country. Do you see any potential for a relenting of this of protectionist sentiment, especially a relenting of protectionist forces against the kind of things that Thailand will be producing in the next couple of decades?
Thank you, sir.
I think the answer is, to the example, is no. I think that there's an irrational protectionist reaction in the United States, in Japan, in the agricultural sector. So you're right. I mean, Thailand is a terrific rice-producing country, and I think that protectionism will hurt Thailand, and I really don't see any relenting of that because of the power of the agricultural lobby, especially in Japan. As far as Thailand's manufactured goods, I think that there will be no more singling out of Thailand than there is of any other country. There may be quotas, but the other countries have prospered under those quotas.
I want to sneak some questions in between calls. We've got 5 minutes left. How are the book sales going?
Well, the book is today is the birthday of the book.
As official publication date?
Today is the official publication date, so it's too early to tell. Obviously, I would love everyone to go into his bookstore and clamor for the book, because if it's not there, say, how could you not have the Four Little Dragons? It's too early to tell.
Atlanta, Georgia. Go ahead, please. You're next.
Yes, I was interested in what effect you might see if the U.S. withdrew their troops from Korea.
I think that, well, as I said before, Carter suggested that. At this point, it is not a practical thing for the United States to do, because the United States, it would be the tension with North Korea stands as tight as ever. And if the United States were to withdraw its troops against, you saw No Tae-woo. No Tae-woo wants the troops there, and so the United States would only withdraw them, if he's to be believed, against their wishes, and that would be a terrible message to send to our allies. So politically speaking, it would be a bad message, and militarily, as long as the tension stands where it is on the border, it may not be a good move for the United States to make.
Another quick one. We said this book was not a dull travelogue. What's your favorite, not favorite country, but what's your favorite part of this book?
Well, I guess my favorite part of this book is probably the most serious, and that's the end. The book ends in a refugee camp on the Cambodian border. And we go away from there with the images in our mind of this great Asia that has come from the swamps of Singapore, across the Strait of Taiwan, risen from the rubble of Korea. And as we came back along the border from Cambodia, and now that Pol Pot may be coming back, we realize how fragile this all is. And how secure, in a way, we are in the United States. I mean, we may be lazy, we may be self-satisfied, but we are free and we are much more secure than any of these places. And I think gives you a lot more respect for what they did and a lot more, makes you a lot happier for our lot here.
Last call for Mark London, this from Boulder, Colorado. Go ahead.
Good evening. Mr. London, I was wondering if you could describe the state of civil liberties and civil rights in these four countries, and are there any movements for democracy in Taiwan, or, well, we know in South Korea there is, and they're brutally repressed. But
okay, sir, thank you. We'll leave it at that if you want a response, because we're running close on time.
I'll quickly respond. Taiwan has a terrific democratic, it has a real springtime politically. The government party there has opened up tremendously, and I think it's following the lead of Japan and Mexico in that it's almost co-opting the opposition with its enlightened policies. Korea, you can see, is writhing in its opening, but I think it's made tremendous strides over what it was 3 or 4 years ago. Hong Kong, you know, has the 1997 question. Hong Kong is not really a political animal. It's an economic animal. No one really cares that much. You feel free as a bird when you're there. Singapore, as you know, Lee Kuan Yew has had a heavy hand in press censorship. He arrested some alleged Marxists a year ago. He is a very, very tough character, and there are restrictions on civil liberties in Singapore. But no, don't misunderstand me. It's not Panama by any means, but it's probably as tight as any of those countries is right now.
90 minutes ago, you opened up this program by saying that Americans ought to be aware of the four dragons and the Pacific Rim generally. Is there something going on over there to which we ought to respond somehow?
Well, I think that these countries are our friends. They want to be our friends, and I think that we should continue to help them and work with them and not follow pig-headed protectionist policies, not follow pig-headed racist policies, minority quotas and things like that. And I think that we've often kicked our friends, and we should be careful about these. They are not our enemies. They are our competitors, and we can have a friendly competition, and I think that we should continue to foster that.
This is the book, The Four Little Dragons, Inside Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore at the Dawn of the Pacific Century. The authors are Brian Kelly, who couldn't make it tonight, and Mark Brown, who's been with us for the last 90 minutes. He adds, by the way, the country of Thailand as a fifth dragon to watch. Is there another project? And you've got 2 seconds to tell us.
The other project is just trying to keep up with our little kids right now.
Thank you very much, Mark London. We appreciate you coming in this evening and standing in for your colleague as well.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you for watching. Thanks for your calls. Have a good evening.